Order. This is meeting number 116 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Welcome to everyone. The first hour and a half, of course, we're using to continue with our Canadian manufacturing study, and then the following half hour we will have committee business. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, August 21st, 2024, the committee is commencing its study on protecting certain Canadian manufacturing sectors, including electric vehicles, aluminum and steel, against related Chinese imports and measures. With us today from the Alberta Uyghur Association, Mehliya Cetinkaya, Program and Outreach Manager. From the Automotive Parts Manufacturer Association, a regular person here, Flavio Volpe, President. And from Clean Energy Canada, Joanna Casares, Director of Public Affairs. We welcome you all. We will start with opening remarks and for up to 5 minutes, and then we will proceed with questions from committee members. Ms. Cetinkaya, would you like to go first, please?
Ms. Chair and members of this committee, thank you for welcoming me today. I'm here to shed light on how Canada's trade with China can be and is complacent in the Uyghur genocide. As many Canadians have learned over the past few years, the Chinese Communist Party has been committing a genocide against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims who live in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang. Since 1949, the CCP has worked to eradicate Uyghur people due to their different ethnicity and religion, as well as with the ulterior motive of stealing and monopolizing the natural resources from the region. This human rights crisis is creeping its way into our Canadian borders. This human rights crisis is creeping its way into our Canadian borders in the form of clothes, textiles, tomatoes, solar panels, EV batteries, and so much more. Reports indicate that over 3 million innocent Uyghurs are currently detained in concentration camps where they face indoctrination, forced labor, and torture in varying degrees. Testimonies from camp survivors like Gulbahar Jalilova, Tursnai Ziauddin, Omar Bakali, and others are too horrifying here to repeat here today. SDIR, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, and our parliament has recognized the CCP's treatment of Uyghurs and other Turkic people of East Turkestan as a genocide. Consequently, Canada can no longer do business as usual with China. The International Labour Organization defines forced labor as the extraction of work or service from any person under the threat of penalty for which the person has not offered him or herself voluntarily. It is clear that Uyghurs are not voluntarily offering to work. On the contrary, they are forced to by the CCP in fear that if they refuse, they and their entire family will be punished or worse, sent to concentration camps. It's estimated that more than 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of East Turkestan to work in factories across China between 2017 and 2019. Some of them were sent directly from detention camps. Uyghurs who live in factories away from home are forced to go through ideological training and constant surveillance and are forbidden religious observances. A local government work report from 2019...
The interpreters are asking if you could just slow down.
Okay,
appreciate you trying to get it all in 5 minutes.
Sorry. I will
just
slow
a
down.
little bit slower.
Okay, I understand. It's estimated that more than 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of East Turkestan to work in factories across China between 2017 and 2019. And some of them were sent directly from detention camps. Uyghurs who live in factories away from home are forced to go through ideological training and constant surveillance. A local government work report from 2019 reads that every batch of workers that is trained, a batch of employment will be arranged and a batch will be transferred. Those employed need to receive thorough ideological education and remain in their jobs. The turn to green energy to lower pollution and costs is good in theory. However, it is clear that this initiative, if sourced from China, cannot and will not be green. East Turkestan is rich in natural resources that are part of the EV battery process. The Chinese government is actively relocating the processing of raw materials and manufacturing of car parts into East Turkestan due to the availability of these large reserves of resources. Ironically, the manufacturing of these green technologies in China are particularly energy intensive and highly polluting. Uyghurs are being used as a source of slave labor in the mining and production of lithium, cobalt, coal, and other materials crucial for these batteries. Purchasing electric vehicles or renewable energy and technologies from China is not only directly upholding forced labor systems in place to eradicate Uyghurs, but also creating even more pollution. As Canada strives to meet climate goals and transition to greener technologies, we must ensure that these efforts do not come at the cost of human rights and, absurdly, our environment. Collaborating with companies that utilize forced labor directly undermines Canada's commitment to ethical trade and social justice. Xinjiang East Hope First Materials, Tianshan Aluminum, Xinfang Group Xinjiang, all closely tied to Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, a military economic entity sanctioned by Canada that plays a big role in the repression of Uyghurs. This company holds thousands of stakes in companies in East Turkestan and frequently participate in forced labor transfers with coal mining companies. I would like to add that the current legislation prohibiting forced labor within Canada is weak. The United States has Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which assumes any products coming from East Turkestan or Xinjiang are made in wholly or part by forced labor until proven otherwise, whilst Canada does not. However, the goal of both countries is to prohibit forced labor from entering our borders, yet Canada has not seized a single shipment or stopped a single shipment at our borders due to the reason of forced labor. The US has stopped 9,791 shipments, releasing 4,537 and seizing 3,975 due to forced labor from June 2022 to date. While our neighbors can uphold their commitment to protecting human rights, why hasn't our government adopted the same policy? Green initiatives cannot truly be sustainable if they rely on Uyghur forced labor. And China is also one of the highest polluters in the world. Supporting the Chinese Communist Party without accountability makes us complicit in these violations of human rights. Our economic and environmental interests cannot outweigh the fundamental human rights of millions of Uyghur people. It's essential to seize and stop goods coming in from China, East Turkestan, or Xinjiang. It is essential that we call on China to address its pollution and CO2 emissions and ensure that our green technologies are ethically sourced by ending the Uyghur genocide and freeing East Turkestan.
Thank you very much. Mr. Volpe, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I appreciate being introduced as a regular person today. Most of you know the APMA. We're the Canadian companies in the automotive business. So that's hundreds of supplier factories, 100,000 employees in volume parts manufacture, tools, and also systems, applied technology systems. Canadian companies have 156 factories in the United States and 120 factories in Mexico. We're very invested across North America with another 88,000 employees in those jurisdictions. Where our bread gets buttered is in the US market. 80% of the vehicles made in Canada are sold to US consumers. 50% of the exports of parts go to factories in the US to manufacture vehicles, 60% of which are imports into Canada. We are extremely integrated. And it's part of the reason why we started at APMA in October of 2023 to push the Canadian government to understand that the flood of Chinese vehicles going into Western markets, which included Mexico, which included seeing a rise in Mexico in 1 year of imports from Chinese sources from 5.4% to 19.7%, is a threat to all of the investments that industry has made in partnership with governments, federal governments here, as well as provincial governments in Ontario and Quebec. And so we said, you've got to open your eyes to Made in China 2025 plan. It's public. The Chinese, amongst other things, want to dominate the vertical of advanced automotive manufacturing. Do something. We worked hard here in raising awareness, and then we went to Washington in November of last year to say the same thing to the Americans, to the White House, Treasury, economy, energy, say you're making heavy investments in a space, but you're also inviting Chinese products in to meet your EV mandates. Make sure you understand what you're doing, and make sure you understand that the Chinese are so far ahead that if you continue down this path, all you're going to do is pay for their goods to be sold to your consumers who you tax to raise the funds to pay for their goods. Canada does not have an OEM. There are no product decisions made in Toronto or Windsor or Ottawa, but we make up to 2 million cars a year. We're one of the 10 biggest players in automotive manufacture around the world. We can supply everything that is in an electric vehicle. The APMA led a project called Project Arrow, where we built out a working vehicle prototype that we've toured around the world, made almost entirely of Canadian parts, except for the screens, because the Chinese, as they did in solar, as they're going to do in batteries and EVs, flooded the consumer electronics markets and busted all the other players in that space. We say China versus market-driven players because in China, it's the state organizing all the players in there. They're either owners at the state level or a municipal level. Shanghai Auto, the biggest Chinese manufacturer, JV'd with lots of Western players. The biggest shareholder is the municipality of Shanghai. Here, everybody talks about, well, you don't want to do this. You're going to protect fat companies, Western companies. We're protecting their profits. Well, they're all publicly traded. So you can see that in the auto business in the West, they all operate in single-digit EBITDAs. I'm very happy to see the Canadian government move forward with an announced 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. One of the things that's important to our sector, and now we're in the middle of our subsector, we're in the middle of another consultation, is what do we do on subcomponents? Well, we should harmonize with the United States. There should be no daylight between us on how we treat those products. They are the vast majority of our market, and they're the vast majority of our imports, and we're co-invested together across the continent. On EV mandates, the CVMA came here last week, said, look, I'm going to put forward a motion. We should harmonize EV mandates. We should do the same thing here. Our EV mandates, and APMA has said this quite publicly many times, cannot be fulfilled. We can't get to 100% EVs by 2035 if we don't have Chinese product in vehicles and batteries. We're walking ourselves into this problem. Barry Bonds cheated in front of fans for years and set records in San Francisco. And it was obvious to all of us. We looked at him, we said later in his career, he shouldn't have been able to hit the ball like that. We watched his hat size go to 8, right? And then after he retired, we all started to look at it. After all the records were broken, after baseball was changed, we said, you know what, he was a cheater. I'm gonna start listening to the testimony on Balco. But we haven't erased those records. And that whole era of baseball is, we don't talk about it anymore. No one's getting into the Hall of Fame. China is playing like Barry Bonds. Knows the rules, gonna break them. We'll find the cream in the clear and we'll beat you. And when you catch up and you wanna moralize and say you did it wrong, you've lost. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you, Mr. Volpe. Ms. Crisayas, my apologies in the pronunciation there. Please, you have the floor up to 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Joanna Kiriazis, and I am Director of Public Affairs at Clean Energy Canada. We're a climate and clean energy think tank at Simon Fraser University. Today, I'd like to talk to you about EV affordability and why this must be a top priority for the federal government and industry if we want to help Canadians through a cost of living crisis and set our burgeoning domestic EV sector up for long-term success. Globally, EVs now make up 1 in every 5 new cars sold, and they're on track for another record-breaking year. Here at home, EV sales are also on the rise, making up 13% of new car sales across the country and nearly a third of new car sales in leading provinces like Quebec. You wouldn't think it from the headlines that you've been seeing, but last quarter, Canada saw the highest volume of EV registrations ever. This is because EVs are one of the best ways to save Canadian drivers money and free them from volatile gas prices. Plugging into our homegrown clean electricity saves a typical EV driver about $3,000 per year on fuel and maintenance. Put another way, today's Canadian EV drivers pay the equivalent of about 40 cents per liter of gas to charge their cars. From a Canadian industry perspective, the transition to EVs has given our auto sector a second life. From 2000 to 2020, Canada dropped from being the 5th largest automaking country in the world down to the 12th. We were losing jobs and investment in our sector. But in the last 4 years, Canada has attracted almost $50 billion in EV-related investments, and we are now ranked the top country in the world for our EV battery supply chain potential. And it's because our country has some huge comparative advantages to offer this growing global industry. Our critical mineral wealth is one, as EVs are 6 times more mineral intensive than gas cars are. Our low carbon steel and aluminum, plus clean electricity to power our manufacturing operations, are another comparative advantage, as companies and countries are preferring cleaner, more responsibly produced products. Our manufacturing footprint, high-skilled workforce, and leading battery researchers are yet another comparative advantage as future vehicles become increasingly high-tech. In short, our auto, steel, aluminum, and critical mineral sectors are better positioned to win an electric vehicle future than they were to win a gas-powered one. As many of these Canadian industries say themselves, this is a generational economic opportunity. But there is a major barrier that stands in the way of these opportunities for Canadian consumers and industry. EV prices are still too high. Polling suggests that upfront cost remains the #1 concern for prospective EV buyers. Canadians currently have limited access to affordable EVs, and manufacturers here in Canada and in the US aren't making them. In our submission, Clean Energy Canada argued that impacts of EV affordability must be considered in Canada's response to Chinese-made EVs, either by considering lower tariff amounts or by complementing tariffs with other measures. Now that Canada has decided to apply an 100% tariff to Chinese-made EVs, the key question is, what will Canadian governments and producers do with this time that they've bought themselves? Clean Energy Canada recommends the federal government, for its part, adopt an EV affordability package made up of the following measures. First, refund and extend the federal incentive program that helps Canadian drivers go electric. This program is more popular than ever this year, but it's set to end in March of 2025, before most made-in-Canada EVs are even available to buy. Second, ensure new and existing condos and apartment buildings have EV charging installed. Millennial Canadians are the most interested in going electric, but they often live in or rent apartment buildings where access to charging is limited. Finally, preserve a strong EV availability standard, which requires car makers to make more EV models available to Canadians and will help drive down the price of EVs. This policy also offers market certainty for the other stakeholders involved, like EV charging providers, electric utilities, and even mining companies, to plan and invest according to expected EV uptake. We believe the federal government can balance multiple interests, addressing consumer affordability and climate change, while also setting our auto industry up for long-term success. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genius, today is up for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Ms. Cetinkaya, thank you for bringing more light here to the ongoing horror that is the Uyghur genocide. From my observation, the ESG movement in practice sometimes feels like the E-only movement. It ignores social and governance impacts in the rush to achieve specific environmental objectives. There is a major risk that the new battery economy is strengthening our strategic adversaries, undermining Canadian workers, and causing untold suffering among Uyghurs, but also people in the DRC who are often exploited by Chinese companies. So we need to be smart about how we respond to these changes. And yet some, in spite of these realities of social and governance impacts, press forward with their kind of one-track mind. I think we need to have an approach that aligns with our economic interests, our strategic interests, and our moral obligations. And that is why Conservatives have pushed for strong measures to counter the strategic efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to dominate the market through tactics that are both anti-competitive and immoral. You spoke in your opening statement about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, a bipartisan bill that passed in the United States that creates a reverse onus, essentially a presumption that those companies that are operating in East Turkestan or Xinjiang are using forced labor. Why is this presumption reasonable in your view? And should we adopt legislation in Canada that aligns with this bipartisan piece of legislation in the United States?
Thank you for your questions, Chair. I want to start by saying 100% this electric vehicle battery, the EV batteries are also, the exploitation in the DRC is very prominent. When it comes to specifically the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act within the US, even the Canadian government has released a study called the Study of Supply Chain Risks Related to Xinjiang Forced Labor, where they clearly state that this is a legislation that we want and trying to adopt within Canada, whereas the U.S. legislation is significantly stricter, assuming all products coming in from that region, because there is a lot of evidence and a lot of reports that show us that things such as cotton, which even our report that the government of Canada has released states that 85% of so-called Chinese cotton is coming from East Turkestan, which means this is directly being linked to the slave labor of Uyghur people, as well as things like tomatoes, solar panels, polysilicon is coming from the region of East Turkestan. Therefore, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is assuming that because of the backing and reports and the facts that are behind these different products that are with forced labor, that anything coming from that region can be assumed to be forced labor because of how it is all interlinked.
Now, one of the things people say about enforcement around forced labor is that it's complicated. It's complicated to unravel these supply chains and figure out exactly what came from where, and to have proper identification and accountability. But it would seem to me that if complexity is the challenge, then we could simply be aligning with our American friends and partners to have an aligned regime so that if a shipment is turned around from docking and unloading its goods in the United States, the same shipment could not be unloaded in Canada. And yet we haven't pursued that kind of alignment. If we had alignment, we could be sharing information. It would actually make our enforcement much easier. And this is in a context where, based on the numbers you presented, the Americans are succeeding and we're failing. They are stopping many shipments. We're not stopping any shipments. And those shipments that are being stopped on their way to the United States could well be coming to Canada. So why don't we pursue greater collaboration with the United States, greater information sharing on forced labor? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
I 100% agree. I think that while both countries, neighboring countries, have the same goal in mind, we do not want forced labor. We do not want to be complicit in a genocide, no matter how far away it is from our home here in Canada or the US. If the US, and it's clear, like you said, has these legislation in place, has the materials, has the resources in place to detect forced labor within shipments, we should 100% be aligning with them, working together with them, and then we can even expand it further and make sure that we can, really have a hand in stopping the use of forced labor.
By expand it further, I suppose you're talking about seeking to partner with other like-minded democratic countries on a collaborative framework to keep forced labor out that benefits workers within the free world and that puts pressure on China to put a stop to this Uyghur genocide. One final question: the USMCA contains provisions on combating forced labor. There's an obligation on the part of parties to that agreement to take actions to combat forced labor. It doesn't include any kind of an alignment of structures, but it includes a commitment. It seems to me a bit of a trade risk if the Americans are able to see that they're putting a stop to forced labor products coming in from East Turkestan and that Canada is not. That raises some questions about our compliance with that agreement. And it seems like a win-win if we could try to bring Canada into line with that agreement and collaborate more with the Americans in order to avoid potential criticism that we're not living up to our trade obligations. I'm basically out of time, but maybe just quickly, if the chair will allow your response to that.
100%, I completely agree. We should have, unity and collaboration with like-minded countries when it comes to forced labor.
Mr. Sheehan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you all for your presentation on this very important matter. My first question, Chair, through you to the panel would be for Volpe, Mr. Volpe. we had some testimony at our last meeting from the Canadian Steel Producers Association. I represent a steel town. It's been feeding into the auto sector for generations. And I asked the question, I said, why? They're decarbonizing the steel industry, and they decided that they would in Ontario. So Algoma Steel is the second largest steel producer in Canada, and they're decarbonizing. And I just asked the question, I said, why is the steel industry doing that? And she just said, because the market's going that way. Would you agree that the auto sector is also heading towards decarbonizing as well? And how important is it for the supply chain in the auto, in particular the EV industry, to be decarbonized?
Authenticity. So if you're going to sell a product that's going to be clean, that is going to have no tailpipe emissions, that is going to help you achieve your green standards, whether those are EV mandates or others, then you've got a responsibility looking at what all of your supplies and all the raw materials, where are they made, how are they made? And in our conversations with American officials, a lot of where they're going on the regulatory front is what's the embedded carbon level in the materials, from steel to the parts that are made out of steel to the cars that they go in. They get it, and I think that we get it too here. But that's also one of the ways in which China is getting an unfair advantage here. 218 gigawatts of new coal-fired power was approved in China over the last 18 months to sell us the steel that wraps the batteries, that goes into the clean cars that come to us from forced and otherwise underpaid labor to meet our objectives.
If we were to develop a national EV supply chain strategy, for instance, you mentioned one thing that might be in there. What other things could we put in? This could be for anyone to answer this too. What other things could be in a national EV supply chain strategy?
Joanna's testimony and the principles behind it are something that we are, almost violently in agreement with. There are very important societal reasons on why you want to have a clean transportation grid. But the way you power that grid is important. The way you power the manufacture of the materials that facilitate that grid are very important. If you are displacing carbon to a lower cost jurisdiction that has an opacity in how it's administered, how it treats people, how it treats labor, and who are using our rules and our willingness to play Boy Scout around the world so they can flood those markets. I was in the solar business before this. Don't get me started about the economics of the solar business. China is not the answer. The strategy is, if we've got raw materials in the ground here, and as Joanna said, Bloomberg NEF says we're the #1 jurisdiction. Well, I represent all the suppliers. When can we buy the lithium, the Canadian cells full of Canadian lithium, or nickel or cobalt or graphite? The answer is at some point. Ford has to buy materials to put in a battery that goes into a production year. If that's 2026 or 2027, pick any automaker you like. If the Chinese are ready, they'll sell it to them. If that's the only way to do it, to be able to build the vehicles to meet the mandates, we're going to have Chinese batteries. We need to take the same focus we did in landing EV investments to saying, how are we going to get the stuff out of the ground, processed, manufactured into cells that are warrantable? And, these tariffs will buy us those 5 years, but that's what we should spend the next 5 years doing. That's what should be in our strategy.
And would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think I'd like to say, if we are concerned about some of these social and environmental practices that China is pursuing in the build out of its battery supply chain, then the answer should not be to slow the EV transition and to give up on our efforts to address climate change. The answer should be to leverage Canadian innovation and ingenuity to do it better and cleaner and faster. And in terms of what would be in an EV battery supply chain strategy, I agree. We need to find ways to accelerate the development of upstream portions of the supply chain. I see what the US is doing, where they are investing in a lot of battery recycling activities to get lower cost materials, battery materials, faster and in ways that are better than for the environment. And they're not waiting for necessarily the new mines to take 10 or 15 years to get it online. They're also investing in those, but they're finding ways to innovate around reducing their reliance on China. Similarly, they're investing in alternatives to graphite, which China controls the global market on, and to make sure that they've got something they can offer instead. Canadian battery companies have a lot to offer, but they're struggling to scale up. So we need to make sure that our approach to building out the supply chain is not only attracting multinationals to invest here, but is also standing up Canadian innovation and helping to scale up emerging Canadian battery leaders, which often are offering lower cost, more environmentally friendly ways of doing business.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for taking the time to be here today. My first question will be for you, Ms. Cetinkaya. We know currently that there are significant gaps in the way that we are monitoring the entry of products into Canada. We know in the US, there were millions of dollars in value of products that were seized. There was only one shipment in Canada that was seized, and that was then later reversed in a judgment. So we could say that there were 0 in Canada. How do we explain such a significant difference in approaches? Because in the case of Canada, it's customs that have the onus to prove that a product is issued from forced labor. In the US, though, it's the company that has the onus to prove that the product was not produced through forced labor. So how can we explain these differences in results and approach?
Thank you very much for the question, Ms. Chair. 100%. I believe the correct number is about $3 billion worth of value that the US has stopped or seized. Whereas the Canadian government actually, Canadian companies are required to report whether or not they have forced labor in their supply chains based on the Customs Tariff Act, where it was amended that companies must report to the Canadian government, and that's available on the public safety website, I believe, a catalog of all companies that have forced labor. Now, they find it hard to report because of third and fourth tier companies who are doing forced labor within, whether it's cotton picking and then transferring it to a different region and things like that. So it is a little bit difficult for companies to report. But the the CBSA has the resources and has the ability to look into these companies that are the third tier companies, because often it is a collection of similar third tier companies where it comes to Nike or different clothing companies. They all have a few groups of Chinese forced labor companies that they use. So the CBSA has the resources and the capability to look into them and question them, and then put out a statement to companies saying you cannot do business with these Chinese companies because they're directly linked to forced labor.
Vous parliez aussi.
Earlier, we were talking about solar panels as well. There are people in the American capital that told me that there has been suspicion, it's not proven, but that solar panels that are refused in the US are simply sent to Canada quite easily. We would sort of be the backdoor garbage can for the US here in Canada. Do you share this suspicion that these rejected solar panels are just sent to Canada?
100%. Yeah. For solar panels, it's specifically polysilicon that's coming from the East Turkestan region. And for cotton, it's said that 85% of Chinese cotton is from East Turkestan. So if the US is stopping them, then, and our Canadian government, who has the same goal, has not stopped a single shipment or seized a single shipment, then I do 100% have suspicions that that's happening.
We know that aluminum production that comes from Uyghur regions in China has massively increased recently, and currently it's about 10% of worldwide supply. Largely, this is exported outside of the Uyghur region and mixed with other metals to create alloys that are often used for the auto industry. According to Human Rights Watch, once these are mixed with other metals, it's impossible to prove that this aluminum has come from Uyghur regions. So oftentimes, this is how forced labor aluminum makes it to the worldwide market. Automakers often don't know themselves where the aluminum comes from that they're using. So do you think it's possible that aluminum is going through the supply chain without automakers being aware of it?
Yeah, so I will say that that is a tactical thing that China is proven to do, whether it's in textiles or whether it's in the automotive industry. However, I will say right here, I have a minimum of 8 companies that are specific on Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang region who are mining for aluminum. So whether or not these companies growing and mixing with other metals, different companies, the origin of where that aluminum is coming from has a company name that it's being extracted from. And that is information that if I have it in front of me, we're able to look at. The CBSA is able to look at, the Canadian government is able to look at if I'm able to prove it here, right here with us. And so also they are moving it out, but they're also creating a lot of factories within East Turkestan to process those raw materials. And then that process of moving out is slowing down. They're actually even manufacturing car parts within East Turkestan as well.
Merci. Et
Thank you. Very quickly, please, could you tell me if automakers are taking the necessary measures to minimize the risk of using materials made from forced labor with aluminum? Mr. Volpe, if you could add something if we have the time after.
No. Recently, Volkswagen is one of the companies who is very prominent in the region for forced labor. They released a report where they lied about what companies they're using. They lied about what processes and what parts of their supply chain has Uyghur forced labor in it. So I do not think the companies are being accountable.
Something quickly.
Sure.
to that.
Automakers who are manufacturing in North America, subject to the USMCA, have a much stricter rigor, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also from their own ESG commitments, the transparency on where things are coming from, and of course, a lot of the aluminum for North American manufacturers coming from Quebec. What Canadian suppliers don't control is where subcomponents may come from other regions, and we've always expressed concern that anything coming from China is suspect.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. I have like 100 questions in only 6 minutes, so I'm going to try to move along fairly quickly. I'm going to start with Ms. Kyriazis. You mentioned that sales in provinces such as Quebec and British Columbia are very high and sort of approaching world sales or exceeding what world sales are. Why is that? Is it the infrastructure on the highways? I know I can drive around, my riding takes 11 hours and I can stop every 15 minutes and charge up if I needed to. Is it the mandates, the sales mandates in those provinces? Is it incentives? Is it all of the above? And what can we do federally to change that pattern across the country so that we see a broader uptake?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Canning. So BC and Quebec are certainly Canadian leaders when it comes to EV uptake. They've both put forward comprehensive policy packages that focus on the demand side of the equation as well as the supply side. So they do offer generous incentives to consumers looking to buy an EV, and they've have the 2 longest running programs in the country. They invest heavily in charging infrastructure, and they have some other measures as well. But most of Canadian provinces actually already offer EV purchase incentives. And so what's different about BC and Quebec is that they have the sales mandates in place, which requires car makers to sell more EVs in those jurisdictions and allocate more of their inventory. You'll often see when a new EV comes to market, they're available only in BC and Quebec first. even the Ontario-made electric Dodge Charger is only available in BC and Quebec at first because the the requirements are in place there, and not yet federally. So what we can learn from them is, I think, the importance of the supply side of the equation, preserving a strong EV availability standard federally, which recruits automakers to use the tools that they have at their disposal to help Canadians go electric. So that could be pricing structures, offering discounts on EVs or low interest financing. It could be making sure their dealers have everything they need to succeed in selling EVs and helping Canadians by answering the questions they have, and by investing in charging. The recent PBO report showed actually that the EV availability standard is going to get us almost all the way to where we need to be by 2030 in terms of our public charging network, largely by leveraging private capital as car makers invest in charging to help meet their sales targets.
Okay, and you mentioned your third point, a recommendation was an EV model standard. I assume this is, my wife and I were out looking for an EV this summer, went to all the lots in the area. There were plenty of EVs available. We had friends who've had EVs and said, you should look at this, this, and this. They're all nicely, we just want a little car to run around town kind of thing with. And all the cars available were big SUV type cars, all the EVs. And some of them used to be small, but had grown over the last few years that's something you see in all sorts of, not in internal combustion cars as well. So is that what this standard would seek to address, this kind of always getting bigger trend we see in other car models?
Well, it'll certainly seek to address the EV prices being too high problem by causing car makers to have to drive down prices to meet their sales.
There are small, affordable EVs available in Europe, for instance, that don't, as I know, come from China.
Yes, right now Europeans have 12 EV models to choose from that are under the price point of $45,000 Canadian. In Canada, we have one, the Fiat 500e. We used to have the Chevy Bolt as an option, but that's been discontinued despite being the second best-selling EV in Canada. So certainly that EV availability standard, among other things, are needed to improve EV affordability and get more Canadians the vehicles they want and can't yet afford.
You have 1 minute and 20 seconds remaining.
Here, I thought things were, I'll just turn to Mr. Volpe and I just want to talk about your comments on the supply chain, battery recycling, graphite, all these things that Canada can do really well. I know I have the tech smelter in my riding and trail that wants to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in an EV battery recycling plant, making it one of the biggest, if not the biggest in North America. I have a graphite mine it's a fabulous graphite mine. It's sitting there idle because all the graphite in the world seems to be mined in Mozambique by Chinese mining interests, and they control that whole thing. What can we do to accelerate, as we have with battery manufacturing, all that investment, accelerate that whole supply chain to get us away from China?
I think we have to stop being naive on why Chinese products are cheap. And the first thing is that they're heavily subsidized. It's an opaque system. They dominate the global markets on the critical mineral verticals. They bet early, but they didn't bet in a market function. These are not companies that speak to analysts and watch their share price. They have a different relationship with return on investment. The tariffs are going to help. They're going to buy some time. But we also have to have a national strategy that says there's a whole bunch of consecutive processes when we approve a mine, maybe like we did during the pandemic when we needed stuff immediately. We looked at those processes and saw how many of those can we make concurrent. It's very nice to talk about consumers should have the cheaper vehicles. But when you're working in a market economy, if the companies are not charities and they're not subsidized, their lots are not subsidized by the federal treasury, if they decide to put a losing product that nobody buys or that they buy and locks in losses, that company won't exist anymore. And so Well, the Canadian supply chain is very for electrification and being at the head of it. Project Arrow, look it up, you'll see how heavily invested we are in it. But there are no charities in this business. That's the difference between here and what the Chinese have set up.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martel, for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today, of course. You can hear me? Mr. Volpe, Canada took its time to implement these tariffs. I would like to know why, in your opinion.
Well, that's a good question because I've asked the same. I think that the gap between the time we missed the opportunity to tell everybody who would have us do it another way that the most important thing in automotive in Canada for return on investment and for jobs and for upstream and downstream opportunities is that we understand that the American market is where the milk gets in the coconut for us. If 80% of what we sell gets sold to an American consumer, there should be no daylight. I commend the government for going aggressively to the American standard, but we're also pushing the government to say, hey, by the way, on the rest of it, go to the American level and tell China and the rest of the world that we know that we can make it a go of it profitably in this continent if we don't put distance between us and the Americans.
D'après vous, là,
In your opinion, when there are regulations like this in the US and we don't follow in their footsteps, or when we take too long to do so, in your opinion, could this limit us or harm Canada in our future bilateral negotiations with the US?
Yes, generally yes. But I will say on this one specifically, and why, when I first spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister when she announced that we would do a 30-day consultation, I said, why are we doing consultation? And in part, the answer was, I thought thoughtful, is that on the critical minerals end of the piece, the Americans don't have that opportunity in the proportion that we do, and that we're all looking for perhaps how the Chinese would respond. And there are pieces of the Canadian economy that help create the balance that we're in, that we need to make sure that we knew what we were getting into before we signed up for that American standard. Generally, though, in automotive, as we learned through the NAFTA renegotiations, there is no room for pushing back on the American consumer base and on the American partner, because also we're about to see whether the former president becomes the new president, and his rather unnuanced way of doing trade is something I think we should all be aware of as we deal with China.
Monsieur Volpe,
Mr. Volpe, the money that we make off of this should be a priority in terms of using it for what? What should we be using this funding for, in your opinion?
Suggesting the funds raised through the tariffs. Well, look, this government, together with its provincial partners, has put its stake on Canada being at the forefront of the electric transition. And so I think where the gap is how we're going to get those minerals to market to go into batteries so that we don't need the Chinese end of it. I'd really like to see a national strategy that has the funding required to get past the hump for all the juniors, the recyclers, and the major mining companies being able to get to market quicker in lieu of a customer and profit.
vous avez parlé du
You spoke of the Arrow project. Could you speak further to this? Because I'm very interested in hearing you talk more about this and how we can integrate aluminum into this project that you mentioned.
Aluminum is very critical in EVs for lots of direct reasons and indirect. Direct, there's a lot of new innovations in energy storage where companies are saying, well, what if we replace some of the major minerals with aluminum? Is that a reliable, dense enough source to be able to build batteries that has that as one of its main ingredients? If we do that, Quebec is a winner. Canada is a winner. On the other end, look, EVs, as as the member beside me here talked about, all cars are getting a little bigger. Well, they're getting a little bigger because safety requirements require them to, but they have to get lighter. And the best way to get lighter with structural integrity, without having to reinvent the wheel, is aluminum. I suspect that the USMCA renegotiations are going to bring us to the Americans saying, and maybe we should say it, hey, by the way, we require 70% of core parts that are steel. We require that steel to be sourced locally. I think that we're going to have that conversation about aluminum. We should.
Thank you very much.
Merci
Ms.
beaucoup,
Ward,
Monsieur Ball.
Thank you very much.
5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Puis
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will be sharing my time with my colleague El Khoury. Ms. Kriasis, from what I've understood with clean energy, you hold discussions with different partners, you are doing research, and you're informing certain political leaders, and if I've understood correctly, you're also stimulating public engagement. So what I've also understood is that you believe that the green transition to clean energy is a unique opportunity for Canada to build a resilient economy, a growing economy, and that it be inclusive. Could you speak to me about how your work is being done with other workers in other countries such as the US, and how this can affect our relationship with our most important trade partner? Do you think that the decision that was made is beneficial to both countries and to our trade relationship?
Oh, the very end cut off. The decision that was made is beneficial to. Can someone help me with the translation?
you
The end of
didn't,
that?
the translation didn't.
To both countries and their workforce. Yes. So at Clean Energy Canada, we've been working on trying to build Canada's EV battery supply chain for a few years now. We have convened stakeholders from across the industry, from mining, automotive parts, auto assembly, all the way through to battery recycling. And we have included academics and representatives from labor as well. And we acknowledged, the threat that China posed to the North American auto sector. We acknowledged the huge head start that China has, decades-long head start, and how much China dominates global supply chains. And so we specifically have looked at what sorts of competitive advantages does Canada have to offer, and how can we complement the US's approach and initiatives and strengths, because we have a different set of strengths. As Mr. Volpe talked about, we are very strong on the upstream portions of the battery supply chain, something that the US doesn't have as much wealth in. And the US has a huge market size that we are able to leverage, as well as a lot of dollars to spend. And so I think certainly aligning with the US in terms of building out a North American EV supply chain is a top priority for us, and is a winning approach for both countries and our workers. But we definitely do have to keep consumers in mind, because something that is going to make or break the success of that future North American industry is that North Americans keep buying EVs.
Yeah.
We need to make sure we have a strong and growing market for this growing industry to serve. And figuring out how to build and
All the
sell
facets.
affordable EVs is going to be the nut that needs to be cracked.
Merci.
Mr. El Khoury, please. for
Merci,
a
Madame la
minute and a half.
Présidente. Monsieur
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Volpe, you recently said the following: we are very motivated, and now we're going to work on defending our market with the best in innovation and with Canada's determination. Could you please elaborate on your enthusiasm pertaining to the measures that our government has recently implemented? Secondly, do you have an opinion to share on the other parts of the supply chain in this sector, such as semiconductors, solar products, and critical minerals? Thank you.
question to give me because as you may know, I'm very enthusiastic about what the Canada's supply chain can do in facilitating this transition, and work very closely with governments at both levels to land the facilitating investments that get us there. You can't get a supplier an opportunity unless you get orders from a car maker. And so if those this is a proximity business. You make a car here, you make the parts, especially the big heavy ones like batteries, you assemble them within an hour or 2 hours of the facility. They act as a cluster. And so this is the greatest investment run in the history of the Canadian automotive sector in partnership with two levels of government from two different parties. Actually, three parties. We include the government in Quebec. I'll refer to Project Arrow when I talk about innovation. Companies like Volta Explorer in Quebec, who work with companies like Martin Rea, who are using graphite and graphene to enhance lithium-ion batteries for range extension. Companies like TM4 out of Quebec that are now part of the Dana enterprise that are working next generation efficiencies into the best electric motors on the market. Companies like Linamar that have decided to work with our fuel cell capabilities in BC with Ballard and say we're going to have a fuel cell vehicle and an EV are almost identical componentry, except either you're hooking up a battery or you're hooking up a fuel cell. In the Ballard example, this is, we've been leaders for 40 years in this space out of BC. And finally, we're going to start to see some of those opportunities come up because we have anchor investments that can order volumes. Linamar is a company started by a tool maker, Frank Hasenfraz, and his daughter has built it into a $10 billion enterprise in a whole bunch of different categories. What those companies need and what the supplier industry needs and what upstream needs is orders that are local. And it's very important to see not just investments from the 5 assemblers are here, but a new one from a 6th one from Volkswagen. On semiconductors, I'll leave you with this.
Mr.
It's the
Volpe,
new-
I'm sorry.
I'll leave you with nothing. Okay, I'll come back to you on that one.
See if you can get those final words in there. Monsieur Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Merci. Alors, je demanderai à Madame.
Thank you. So I'll ask Ms. Kyriasis from Clean Energy some questions. Last week, for our first meeting, we heard from Electric Mobility Canada that called for the implementation of green procurement or green call for tender. So this would mean that we would change the way in which we're able to do our call for offers in the public sector, respecting some environmental criteria. We know that there have been studies that show that this would meet the requirements of international law, because right now, if we try to negotiate exceptions, since there is no chapter on this in CUSMA, though it was the case in NAFTA before, this could be problematic. That being said, green procurement would respect laws, and there are many companies that would be able to play their role in this. So do you think that this is something that we should implement?
Green procurement is a huge opportunity and a win-win. I think it's a tool that is unfortunately not being leveraged to its full potential here in Canada. So the government promised a comprehensive Buy Clean strategy federally a few years ago. And we have seen some promising steps through the greening government strategy that's focusing on preferring lower carbon, often Canadian-made materials in federal, building investments, like the low carbon steel, aluminum, cement, and wood products. But where the real impact could be seen is leveraging the federal infrastructure dollars that are going to provinces and municipalities, whether it's roads, bridges, or the massive housing build out that we're hoping to see in the next decade. And so we would like to see similar Buy Clean requirements added across all federal infrastructure spending, so that we can be building a better and bigger market for that low carbon steel, aluminum, again, that's often Canadian made, to help Canadian producers scale up. When it comes to EVs, we could also be better leveraging our procurement powers federally and provincially to be setting more ambitious targets to green government fleets, and then actually meeting those targets, because that's been slower to happen than it should be.
Ben,
Thank you
justement,
very much. I'm sorry the time is up. Mr. Cannings for 2.5.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn to Mr. Volpe and hopefully get a couple of questions in. First, I want to say, as someone who wears a size 8 hat, we're not all liars and cheats. But I appreciate the story about Barry Bonds. What I'm just like to shift not just to hats, but to tires. And I know this may not be part of your parts manufacturing. I was talking to people from Cal Tire last week, who are a major tire retailer in Canada based in the Okanagan Valley. And they also make retread tires for trucks. And so they kind of recycle these tires. And just in the last few years, they have been overwhelmed by cheap products coming in from China that are being dumped into the North American market. And they can't make a retread tire cheaper than these new tires. And the United States has slapped duties on these tires or stopped them from coming in. Just wondering if we should be expanding our view here to things broader than EVs and that EV supply chain.
Yes. EVs, the V in EV is a vehicle. And we spent a lot of time talking about the E and the rest of the vehicle, tires. Actually, tires tire technology is designing the compound and the tread for less resistance, for a longer range on the E side. It's not the first time I've heard that. And yes, we do have tire manufacturer here in Canada. Tires, the rubber industry, like the aluminum industry, like the steel industry, like the lithium industry, is dominated by the Chinese and their opaquely subsidized processes, in which they invest in everything except for labor to sell us the cheapest stuff so that we can get a lot of times people will buy tires because they need a new tire, but they don't think about the performance and length of it. And so they buy the cheap Chinese stuff, and it's a problem.
And another quick question. You mentioned Chinese response to these actions by Canada or the United States. Is there a differential response to Canada because we're not a big player like the United States? You know, we saw China come in immediately and threaten our canola industry. But I haven't heard any actions against the United States.
I noted quite publicly, quite quickly, that the Chinese response to similar actions out of the U.S. and Canada is take the U.S. to the WTO for the IRA production subsidies, and be silent on their tariffs, and then come after us on tariffs, and then immediately say, before we actually have that hearing, we're going to make something up on canola. This is the country that arrested the two Michaels. Great piece in the CBC today about what that actually means for people. I'm not sure why we have Canadian apologists for Chinese. They will pick on us like they pick on Australia, and see if they can get a moral victory against us, while they know that with the Americans, if they actually beat them on something, the Americans will counter.
Sorry, Mr. Cannings. Can I take the initiative? We keep hearing a lot about Volkswagen, and they're not on our witness list. Can I take the initiative to invite Volkswagen to come before committee, specifically to do with forced labor and many of the other things we're hearing today? Is that okay? Everybody's in agreement? Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Baldinelli, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being with us this morning. I'm going to go to Mr. Volpe, and just building on what some of the comments of my colleague earlier, and he had mentioned you'd done a recent interview with BCC Bloomberg, and you talked about about 11 months it took of you negotiating and putting your thoughts forward to the government on the EV tariff, and it took a while. But also, you also in your testimony, you've just talked about the current consultations that are going on with the subcomponents. Do you have concerns there, and what are your thoughts on that? I mean, should we not be, given the highly integrated nature of our market, just simply continuing on our following on what's going on in the United States?
I'm going to preview my submission in full here.
Okay.
Match the U.S. measures. That's it.
Now, quickly, I mean, my colleague from Green Energy Canada talked about earlier about the low-cost production vehicles that are out there. I know my colleague from BC, Mr. Cannings, was looking for one too. I think GM just announced recently that it's retooling. It's one facility in Michigan will be producing the GM Volt again starting in 2025. So that's good news for consumers in that regard. But you also spoke, Mr. Volpe, about the highly integrated nature of our auto sector. I mean, since the Auto Pact in the 60s, and the emission standards approach. I mean, we've followed that approach with the United States since that time. But with the sales mandate of 2035 and the U.S. not having a sales mandate, are we even able to meet that mandate in the production? We won't have a supply chain established in Canada by that time to service the requirements of getting an industry started. Would you not agree?
Yeah, look, if you look at my public statements from the beginning, from when the EV mandate was first proposed at the end of 2022, and then when it came in, we will not meet that standard. One of the things we implored the environment minister to do is, and the previous environment minister, this industry works when the EPA and Canada are aligned. California is an important market, but it's a market. States that align with California are important, but they're markets. Car companies who operate on single-digit EBITDA will build to the bigger market. And if you diverge and you cause for companies to have to engineer a different configuration, you're going to take cost out of them. Now, who wins? Companies that don't have to profit. And where do they come from? China. Why did Western-based players fly into China in the early 2000s when they joined the WTO? Well, first of all, there are no Canadian OEMs, so I'm not maligning any Canadian OEMs. OEMs said, well, we can make more profit if we take advantage of the manufacturing costs deltas there. Well, the Chinese learned how to make cars at global quality standards, and they learned the manufacturing processes, the technology in that, as well as anybody else. But what we didn't calculate was they don't care about profit.
Yeah.
So now we're in trouble.
And 2 minutes. And the notion of let's regulate the emission standard and leave the consumer choice there. And the Vehicle Manufacturers Association mentioned that just the other day. And I mean, there are ICE engines that are highly effective in their emission standards, right? Hybrids and EVs. And again, I don't think we'll be in a position to meet the 2035 standard now in terms of establishing an integrated supply chain. So why don't we place it again, go back to what's been so successful for the industry and having those emission standards in place. And as the market matures, you'll see the growth of the EV market. Would you not agree?
Yes, I think we're all committed to that electrification. Electrons versus combustion is actually good for everybody. Better product, cleaner product, and I think Canada's positioned to win there. Okay, but there's nothing wrong with saying that you bought a 6-cylinder Dodge Charger from Windsor. It supports a lot of jobs, and
I've got a 2022 Buick Enclave. I worked at 4 summers at General Motors, so I purchased a GM product. The carbon intensity that went into the production of that vehicle is cleaner than what would come in from China today, and people don't realize that. So how do we get people to understand or reconcile the fact that, I mean, what is coming in from China is you've got a state-sanctioned, low cost. They're heavily subsidizing slave labor, and they're 1/3 of the world's carbon emissions.
So how do we do that? I think we have to do things like this. We have to have frank conversations amongst each other that are nonpartisan, that say, okay, look, do we like the jobs? Do we like the industry? Do we like the investments in Canada? If we do, and we value that EV transition, we know that Canadian auto industry is always one when it can sell to American consumers. What are the American regulators doing for that market? We should do the similar thing here. Now, that's not to say, hey, the Americans are going to take the lead. I think we have better auto drive and connected drive technology in this country. We have the upstream capabilities and the ability to be a major battery player globally here. But if we jump out quicker than companies like Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada that made 125,000 hybrids last year that don't qualify in any of the standards, we're going to try to go faster than Toyota. Well, that means going into the arms of BYD and CATL, and there's no Canadian content there. And everybody there makes $2 an hour when they get paid.
Bravo. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Arya, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's interesting. Obviously, you will not find with all the political parties supporting this tariffs. I don't think there's going to be any dissenting witness. I don't think they will dare to come and dissent before this committee. But international free trade, as we know, is dead. Is that I foresee a time in near future where we'll build a firewall around Canada, United States, and Mexico. Maybe we'll just open a bit for our friendly countries like Korea, Japan, Australia, and maybe part of Europe. Mr. Wolpe, it was quite interesting when part of answering you mentioned, indicated safety as the reason why North American car manufacturers are building bigger cars. And immediately my thought was, what about the millions of small cars currently running in Canada now? And the cars, small cars that we are importing from our friendly countries like Korea and Japan. Anyway, that is a discussion for a different time. Mr. Joan Kriakis, thank you so much. You did mention several times, he emphasized the EV affordability, which I agree with. To fight climate change, we have taken the right direction to go for the electrical vehicle things. And not just the electrical vehicles, but also energy storage, etc. But talking of electrical vehicles, you did mention affordability in a big way. As I'm sure you know, I know that no North American manufacturers are planning any affordable size, I mean small size electrical vehicle. In your view, I know you may not have done the extensive study, how many years or how many decades you think it will take for North American car manufacturer to start building affordable or small electric vehicles?
Well, I think it has to happen soon if we want to be able to reach mainstream buyers.
It has to happen soon. I agree. I
Yeah.
want to know, what is your time estimate? How many years we Canadians who can't afford to buy bigger vehicles have to wait?
Let's say 5 years. Let's say 5 years. And this idea that there's no demand for smaller, more affordable vehicles,
No,
it's not true. The
It is
top
not
selling
true.
vehicle in Canada by far is the Tesla Model 3. Before the Chevy
and
Bolt
even in
was
the-
discontinued, the second top selling EV was the Chevy Bolt. These are small, affordable electric vehicles.
And even in the gasoline cars, if I'm not wrong, Honda Civic is the top selling car in North America, if I'm not wrong. But anyway, I got limited time. I'm sure you appreciate that. On the energy side, we are talking about we have got critical minerals, from mines to mobility we talk about. Most of the time, the talks are around developing mines and developing batteries, manufacturing batteries and manufacturing electric cars. I don't see many of us talking on the critical component of mineral processing, which China controls 70 to 90% of the market in the world. So should we impose tariffs on that now?
I think when we're talking about the upcoming consultation or the current consultation around all of the other parts of the battery supply chain, it's very hard to paint that with a broad brush. Just in terms of the critical minerals, we've got 31 to think about, or at least 6 or 7 that are very high value within the EV battery supply chain. So I think in each case, we have to look at what's the level of reliance on China. What alternatives do we have available and when can they come online? What are Canada's capacities to produce those components? And then again, what are the cost impacts on producers and ultimately Canadian buyers? And so when we're talking about things like cathode active materials or battery cell manufacturing, we have landed a lot of investment in those parts of the supply chain in Canada.
I got very limited time. Mr. Wolpe, one quick question. We have imposed tariff on steel imports you come from the manufacturing sector, so I'm sure you'll appreciate. There are many products within the steel industry that are not manufactured in Canada. In fact, CFIB, Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses, have raised this issue where the products that are not manufactured in Canada are also getting tariff imposed on them, making it unnecessarily expensive for Canadian small businesses. So do you agree, do you support imposition of across the board tariffs on steel imports?
I think the treatment of steel is very clear in automotive in the USMCA. And I think you had the steel people in here last week. There's no daylight between us and their position. And I will say that this current government has invested in making small electric vehicles with Honda in 2027, I believe. And they're available from all of the manufacturers that are Western based in this market over the next few years. So I think you may want to correct that.
And if I may, one last question on the same grounds. You said no charities in business. That's an interesting thing because that's the right thing. I come from private sector. How come the North American car manufacturer have stopped manufacturing small vehicles when the friendly countries like Japan and Korea are still manufacturing small cars and continue to be profitable?
Those Korean and Japanese manufacturers manufacture those small vehicles in North America at a profit. So in as much as that is a North American investment by a Western-based player, I'm not sure that your characterization is correct.
No, then you mean to say that the major manufacturers like General Motors, Ford, etc., North American based, so the argument you use, no charities in business, I thought it was related to small car manufacturing, if I'm not wrong. So then you are only referring to the North American owned or North American car manufacturers.
I think you misunderstood the
Can you
characterization
clarify that,
Yeah.
Mr. Volpe, so that it's
There's no
clear?
charities in business, meaning that in the automotive business, they're all private companies and they're either private or they're publicly traded, but they have to produce a profit. Otherwise, there's no path forward. If there's a difference in China, you can be a major manufacturer and a major supplier and not have profit as one of your dynamics. So charities, I would say, I used in quotes, and sorry if you missed the nuance.
I think that's clear. Everybody understands exactly what Mr. Volpe was meaning. We have to go into committee business, which takes a bit of time. Is there anyone that has some urgent question that they need to get an answer to today? Okay, I guess everybody is all right. Okay, so to our witnesses, thank you so very much for the information. We will take it forward, and I'm sure you'll be keeping an eye on what work the committee is doing as we progress. All right, thank you very much. I will suspend while we can go into in camera. Thank you very much.